All right. Welcome to another episode of Tell Us More About That. It feels like an eternity since we did this last time. I think almost 6 weeks. We had pushed out like 14 episodes, and Jen and I were like, can we maybe just call that like season 1 and take a little break?
It was a lot.
It was fun though. So we took a little hiatus just to focus on some other things, but we are getting up and going again. So our first guest on season 1.2.
Wouldn't this be season 2?
Season 2, sure. Our first guest back from our break is Kate Myers. So we are super excited about this conversation. We've wanted to have somebody on to speak specifically to child forensic interviewing, and that is Kate's area of expertise. So Kate, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we got you. It looks like, are you at the office?
I am. Is it the prison grade brick?
That's part of the clue.
Yeah.
That would be an interesting interior design choice if this was your house.
The olive green really makes it homey.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, no, it's great. We were spending our morning. It is 10 a.m. on a Thursday morning with Kate. So thanks for taking time to chat with us today.
No problem.
All right, so I always leave it up to the guests to introduce themselves, just because you'll do yourself better service than I will do, I'm sure. So, Kate, would you mind introducing yourself for the audience?
Sure. My name is Kate Myers. I am the forensic interview program manager at my local child advocacy center. I've been conducting child forensic interviews in some capacity for about the past 10 years.
Oh, nice. Okay. So our audience it's a diverse group of, I would say for the most part, focused on people that are interested in just general topics under the psychology umbrella, but we have had a handful now of episodes that have been a little bit more geared towards interviewing. With that being said, though, I don't want to assume that everyone knows what a child forensic interviewer is. So if you could give us a little bit of kind of a layman's definition of what it is that a child forensic interviewer actually does.
Yeah. So the forensic interview is an investigative interview, and it is conducted in a way that's developmentally sensitive, trauma-informed, and legally sound. And they are conducted within the context of a child abuse investigation. So it's when there's a concern that a child might have experienced abuse or witnessed crime or some other type of violence. And that's typically conducted by a neutral, trained professional in a designated setting.
Okay, interesting. So you said you work at a child advocacy center, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Is that generally where someone would find the child forensic interviewers to be, or are they ever embedded in with a law enforcement agency, or how does that generally break down?
So, yes. So generally, your child forensic interviewer is part of the Child Advocacy Center, which is typically, though not always, a nonprofit organization that's part of a multidisciplinary team in a given jurisdiction. Now, that can look really different depending on jurisdiction, depending on resources. The setup doesn't always look the same, but generally it is a designated trained professional, and best practice is that professional is a neutral person to the investigation. So not necessarily part of the investigative team. That being said, lots of people on the multidisciplinary team all around the country receive training in child forensic interviewing. The majority of them don't then go on to conduct forensic interviews, but many of them do. So you will see investigators with both law enforcement and child protective services who conduct child forensic interviews for their jurisdiction.
Okay, well, I knew that there was training for child forensic interviewing. I actually didn't realize, or maybe I didn't just think about it as much of a traditionally trained detective getting, more of a specialization in child interviewing and kind of conducting those in-house. You had mentioned you guys being a neutral party a couple times. Can you expand a little bit more on why that's important?
It's important to the defensibility piece, and it's also important to the setting the child up to be comfortable piece. So defensibility, we're looking at, do I have a say in the trajectory of this investigation? No, I am not determining whether or not a crime occurred. I am not this child's therapist. I am not determining whether or not this child needs to be removed or whether the caregiver is, doing what they need to do to keep this child safe. And so I don't have any part of the outcome. I have a very discrete role in this child's life. That also means that I can defend, I guess, the level of knowledge that I'm going to have about this child and about the family. And, I say, like, this is just my role. I don't have anything else to do with this kid or this family, right? That makes that process more defensible. When you're thinking about a child and who they're talking to and where they're talking to that person, the setting is extremely important. Ideally, kids are no longer being forensically interviewed in police stations, in their schools, in a room at their home. Like, we want them to be in a neutral setting, which is what a child advocacy center is. We want it to be child friendly, warm colors, comfortable seating. It is set up to be private and safe for kids. And so we don't want there to be any connotation for that child that they might get in trouble or, that somebody might be getting arrested or might be getting removed because we're at CPS. So the neutral part is really important.
And I'm newer to working with children, but child advocacy centers are also newer for me. Just in general, we are in Wilmington, and I know that we have a child advocacy center here. Are they pretty typical now? Are they kind of becoming a thing that most areas will have?
Yes. So the CAC model is a fairly recent way of responding to child abuse. It came out of, I think, the 80s, and the 90s is when things really started taking off. So it is a nationally and now internationally replicated model of responding to child abuse. So the Child Advocacy Center, in an ideal world, kind of centralizes service provision for the child and also streamlines teamwork and communication for the multidisciplinary team. So before there were CACs, if a child disclosed abuse, typically they would have to run themselves all over to the different agencies that needed that information. They'd be going to the police station, they'd be going to CPS, going to the hospital. Eventually they'd be talking to the Commonwealth Attorney. If it went to prosecution, they'd be going somewhere else for therapy, right? So, like, obviously, I think most people can see that's not great for kids. It's not trauma-informed to have a child have to say the same thing all over again, especially if it's about a traumatic incident. The other thing from an investigative point of view is it's not good to have multiple statements from your victim or witness out there, because no matter what, those statements are going to sound a little different. And so you're setting your victim or witness up to sound inconsistent, which is not necessarily the case. That's just the way that we talk and the way that memory works, right? So we wanted to kind of bring that all together in one place to both reduce the trauma for that child and to streamline the investigation. So the CAC model should be like a one-stop shop for services and a way for the multidisciplinary team to come together so that the child is only interviewed a minimal amount of times, a lot of times just the one time. They can receive services in-house, and everybody who needs that information can get it at the same time, and they can share information, work together. It makes for a stronger investigation and prosecution.
So is your, and I think models might vary a little bit, but some might have like the I don't know, two-way mirror, or it's recorded, right? So is everyone sort of like in a separate room watching the same thing?
Yes.
Is that the team?
Yes.
Okay.
So best practice is that all forensic interviews are video and audio recorded, and I would hope that in the year 2024, everybody's doing that. Um, yeah, rooms are set up differently. Most of the rooms that I've conducted interviews in were set up, with closed circuit television. So I'm in the room with the child, and it's just me and the child in the room. And then there is an observation room where the investigators can watch live, and that's where I'm going to leave. And check in with the investigators about 3/4 of the way through to see like what's not clear, what do you need me to go in and ask follow-up questions about, what did I forget to ask, and the investigators can also leave with a copy of that recording. That's not something that CACs typically retain, so that gets wiped from our system after 60 days. That's technically, in our view, the evidence of the investigators.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Yeah, that's great.
So when we talk about child of the child forensic interviewing, like what is the age range that you guys are really focused on?
So we're talking about kids sometimes as young as 3 all the way up to 17.
So the main types of cases that you had mentioned, like sexual assault, physical abuse, you just mentioned the human trafficking. Are those kind of the majority of the cases that you're getting involved with, or what does that breakdown look like?
For lack of a better phrase, the bread and butter of child advocacy centers and of forensic interviews is child sexual abuse. And so that's going to be the majority of the cases that come through most child advocacy centers. And everything else kind of depends on the jurisdiction and your capacity. So I would say it is, I have seen, and it's absolutely appropriate for kids to receive forensic interviews when there's concerns of acute or unusual physical abuse. Certainly witnesses to violence, domestic violence, homicide, other types of community violence, kidnapping. When I was a federal forensic interviewer, the majority of those interviews were online exploitation of youth. So that was a lot of like sexploitation, child sexual abuse material. And, occasionally, depending on jurisdiction, you might be seeing trafficking victims as well. But I like to encourage investigators, no matter where I work, no matter what what we say in our code has to come through the CAC, like please think of this space and this process for all children who have experienced trauma that you need interviewed for a criminal investigation. This is, I think, a really good place for kids to come. And so we are open to seeing kids in all types of circumstances.
So then the children that come through your doors, they are in an active criminal investigation. It's not, CPS or DSS was involved and they're moving a child from the home. Maybe they're in foster care and they're trying to get more information. This is like an active investigation with law enforcement involvement.
Yeah, so it has to be an active law enforcement investigation and or an active CPS investigation. And it just so happens that those things are often concurrent. A lot of times we see cases with just law enforcement involved. Occasionally we see cases with just CPS involved, but generally law enforcement is almost always involved in the cases that come through.
So the neutrality piece of this, if you have an objective to just get information from the individual, and it's not one way or the other. It's not to confirm one side or incriminate the other. To what extent do you want to be informed on the details of the investigation before you go in and talk to a child? Like, is there a strategy to knowing less so that there is not that risk of contaminating what they say, or what's kind of the approach there?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I think that has changed over time in the fields. I don't know of anybody personally that does blind interviews, but I've heard of that being done, and I think over time it's been done less and less.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the vein of that argument that like I can then say like I really didn't know anything about this allegation and this child, but I think what people have found is that you're not really setting that child up for success if you don't know anything about how they communicate, anything about like potential barriers to disclosure. There's certainly information included in the investigation prior to the interview that might be considered like externally verifiable or especially reliable, right? It's not just, this is information that's coming from one of the kids' caregivers. This is like, no, this is a mandated reporter that made a report after their child disclosed to them. So that's pretty reliable information that I can defend saying like, that's just a fact that was shared with me. That's not like a rumor that was shared about the family with the interviewer. So it can be really appropriate for the interviewer to know that there's kind of like hard facts about the allegation or about the investigation so far. And even it can be appropriate to introduce that information in the interview in a sensitive, defensible way.
Sure.
Again, to kind of facilitate the process and hopefully set the child up for success, and success just being like the ability to participate in the process.
Well, then you said mandated reporting, and I'm from Illinois, and we're in North Carolina now, and the mandated reporting laws in those states are different, which I found interesting. Like in Illinois, you have to have certain titles, you're an educator or like part of the church or a therapist or there's a, doctor or whatever, but in North Carolina, and I think Virginia as well, it's anyone over the age of 18. You are like by law a mandated reporter, and if you have information, you can get a misdemeanor for not reporting it, but I don't think anyone actually follows up on that. But Kate, I don't know where you're located. Are the mandated reporting laws pretty open there, or?
We're in Virginia.
Okay.
My understanding is that it is. I thought that in Virginia it was more narrow, that it was certain professions that were mandated reporters.
Oh, okay.
I did used to work in DC, and that was every adult. Every adult is a mandated reporter. So that made things a little less fuzzy when it came to kind of understanding obligations. But yeah.
Yeah. I was curious. So I was a school counselor for many years, and I was working with elementary school kids this past year, and that was like learning a whole new. I went from high school to elementary, and it was like learning a whole new language. But I made a couple reports as a mandated reporter, and you either know it's going somewhere or you don't know it's going somewhere. And so I'm always curious, like how a child ends up kind of on your doorstep, and knowing now that it's an active investigation, but is it the investigators that bring a child there? Is it a caregiver or a parent or a therapist? Like, how do they typically find their way to you?
Yeah, so I'm speaking like in super general terms. So say that the child is at school and discloses to you, the school counselor, and you make that phone call to the CPS hotline. They're going to make a decision whether they're going to be screening it in for investigation or for in-home assessment, or they're going to be screening it out. It doesn't fall within the parameters of what CPS does. If the allegation includes a crime, ideally CPS is kicking that to law enforcement, no matter whether or not they're taking the case. And so ideally, like that kind of triaging is happening really quickly. Certainly with allegations of child sexual abuse, those can be pretty high priority cases to kind of figure out and to deploy resources for. So say that it's screened in and an investigator is assigned. Ideally, if there's a joint investigation, detective and CPS investigator are talking pretty immediately, like, hey, I got this case. I heard you got it too. Let's talk about what we're going to, like when we're going to contact the family, how we're going to contact the family, like what we know about the bad guys so far, if we need to like strategize around that. But the forensic interview typically is one of the first steps in that investigation. So a lot of times when investigators call the Child Advocacy Center, it's pretty immediately after they've received the case. So like, hey, I just got a case. It's a, they'll tell me about the allegation and the kid. And best practice generally is that kid is coming in for their forensic interview pretty quickly. So I have heard like throughout my career that within 48 hours, ideally, if that child is an active disclosure of child sexual abuse, whether or not it's historical abuse, whether or not there's imminent risk of harm, it's still best practice to get them into the CAC for a forensic interview when they're an active disclosure. So we try to arrange our resources to be able to kind of receive things that quickly. And we do a lot of training with our investigators to ensure that they're bringing kids in as quickly as possible. So, they've received the case, they contact us, we say, yep, we're available tomorrow at 9 a.m. They contact the family. Depending on the allegation will depend on how the investigators interact with the family and how much information they share. There's typically like very limited information sharing at the beginning just to protect the integrity of the investigation. And so they'll, tell the caregiver, usually, I'm so-and-so, there was a safety concern involving your child that got reported. It's really important for us to hear in your child's words and just make sure that everything's okay. We'd like for you to bring your child to the Child Advocacy Center tomorrow at 9 a.m. And most of the time, like that's kind of what happens. And so we arrange the appointment. The caregiver, the non-offending caregiver will bring the child for the appointment, and they will meet with one of our family advocates while the child is being forensically interviewed. So that is typically happening pretty quickly after a report. And again, that's very general explanation and also like pie in the sky explanation of how things should go once you make a report.
Yeah. Do you ever have parents, not like show up at your doorstep, but do you ever have parents that don't have that exact process, get some information and like you're their first step? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so we have caregiver advocates here who are amazing professionals, and they will talk through that with caregivers, and kind of depending on the situation, they'll talk through their options, which sometimes will include like if you have concerns that your child has been abused, like here's how you can make a report, and they can help that caregiver make the report and kind of walk them through what it might look like after that. Sometimes it might not be a circumstance where it's appropriate to go that route, but maybe the child is at the point where they just need therapy. And so that's something our advocates will help direct them to as well. So, so we are absolutely used to being contacted by caregivers and by other people in the community and service providers, school counselors, teachers, just being like, hey, I have this situation. What do you think I should do? And we are more than happy to talk through that with people.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
So I'll back it up a little bit, because then I want to get into kind of like a hypothetical interview type scenario. But if for children specifically, what are the elements and variables like within a kid that makes it so unique to have this type of intervention? Like what about interviewing a child is so much different from interviewing an adult?
Have you met a kid? Yeah. So age is a huge factor in interviewing, age and developmental level. So not just the way that kids communicate, but the way that they store information and code information. Just age and development alone is a huge factor in how they might be able to talk to you about that. Kids who potentially experienced something traumatic when they were pre-verbal, they didn't encode that in a way that that included language. And so you have to be able to manage your expectations and know that the kids that experience abuse pre-verbally might not be able to ever tell you with their language what happened. And so just thinking about that whole range of 3 to 17 and everything that the brain goes through in that amount of time, it's astronomical. Mm-hmm. And then you layer on, in our context, trauma, cultural considerations, disability can be a mediator, and just the fact that kids are not used to having conversations with adults like that. They're not used to being in non-didactic situations with adults where the adult doesn't have all the answers, and they're going to get in trouble. The kid's going to get in trouble for having the wrong answer, not knowing the answer, right? Like, that's kind of unusual. Mm-hmm. Kids are also not used to being asked to supply the level of detail that we often are asking them to give. And so it kind of takes somebody who knows how to kind of help the child get to the place where they're like, oh, she's looking for a lot of detail that I'm not used to being asked. Because if you think of the way that adults a lot of times interact with kids, they're not necessarily trying to elicit like long narratives, which is what investigators need. Like your kid comes home, how was your day? Fine. Did you have gym? Yeah. What was your favorite class today? Recess. Like, you're asking lots of yes or no questions. You're not asking questions in a way that they're gonna naturally elaborate. And so that's something that you have to kind of practice with the kid. So there's a lot of considerations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, that's perfect. So you touched on a couple things. The first is non-verbally being able to communicate to you as the interviewer what may have happened to them. Can you talk a little bit about some of the techniques to how you're still able to extract some of that information and experience from the child?
Yeah, I'm sorry if that was not clear. The forensic interview process is for children who are able to communicate verbally one way or another. And so that is how I am trying to elicit information in the interview. And if they're communicating in other types of ways, I need to be really careful that I'm not interpreting any behavior or anything else that they're doing in the interview. So the focus of the forensic interview process is that verbal communication.
Yeah, so no, and that's a good distinction. So what I was getting at is, if something happened to the child before they were verbal, and you need them to be able to verbalize that, can you talk about like how do you cross that gap between getting them to articulate something that they couldn't articulate at the time when it happened?
Yeah, I don't know if you can always anticipate crossing that gap. And so as a team, if there's an investigation, I think you have to talk about being really creative in how you're corroborating the allegation, because you might not be getting that statement from your victim. You might have to get your evidence in lots of other creative ways, which they should be doing for all cases, even when the kids are able to talk about what happened. But they might need to work even harder to kind of go around that. And then just thinking about the best interest of the child is, perhaps the only and like best next step for them is for them to participate in therapy. And if there's lots of therapy modalities, especially for children, where they're able to kind of process traumatic events non-verbally. So our therapists here are really good about doing some of that work with kids, play therapy, EMDR, in a way that can kind of, support the mental health of that child without them necessarily having to talk about like the event that happened.
That's where I feel like that's got to be one of the hardest parts of that job. And when you said, have you ever talked to kids? That's why talking to kids is so tough. I don't even know, when Jen would come home from work and she would tell me about these conversations, it's funny how they evolved from when she first started working with that age group to when it ended, because it's almost, if you don't have little kids and you don't interact with that age group all the time, it's awkward. Like, you don't know what to say. It's not. It's like you're talking to something that's not even human. Like, you're just like trying to understand, but they're looking at you and have no idea what the heck you're talking about.
It's almost intimidating because they, like you said, Kate, they look to adults for the answers, but the adults are asking them to provide like contextually complex answers.
Yeah.
and they're like, well, I don't know. Why don't you know that? And it's like, well, I'm asking you. And so we're talking about like that Spider-Man meme where you're like pointing at each other and looking at each other. It was intimidating in the beginning, because I was like, how I know how to ask this question to an adult or to an older child, right? But a third grader, I'm like, I don't know. So it was intimidating.
Well, I will say, like, that's one of the things that I think is really, like, once you've actually have done interviewing for a little while, you realize how freeing it is, because you don't have to know anything. And in fact, it's better if you don't go in trying to know stuff. You are just going in and asking more questions. You don't have to think of topics to talk about, because you're really just asking the kid, like, tell me what you like to do. Oh, you like to play Minecraft? Tell me about Minecraft. I've had like 500 kids explain Minecraft to me and I still don't understand it.
Same. Yeah.
But, you know, like, even if they're talking about something that I personally know a lot about, like, my role in that moment is not to, like, share what I know. It's to sit back and like, I want you to tell me everything you know or everything that you like about that thing. So in my role, I'm not necessarily having to bring that to the table. I just need to create an environment where I can get the kid to talk about what they know or have experienced.
Yeah, I love that. So when you talk about how kids generally interact with adults, especially adults that they don't know or trust, so you ask these questions of like, how was your day? Good. Did you go to recess? Yes. Did you talk to or make any friends? No. Like, it's very like one word type exchanges, close-ended questions. How do you kind of condition or prime a kid when they come in to be able to gauge? Do they even have the ability to give me more like of a narrative and more detail? And if you believe that they do, how do you get them to the point where their answers start to evolve into things that are more contextual and more narrative style?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's typically like two main sections of a forensic interview. No matter what forensic interview protocol you're trained in, there's typically like the pre-topic of concern section of the interview, and then you've transitioned to the topic of concern. That's kind of like the second part. So that whole first part tries to accomplish exactly what you just said. So, you know, I spend time, and I tailor this depending on the age and development of the child that I'm talking to, explaining my role, explaining the room. There's a set of interview guidelines that explicitly lets the child know this is not a typical adult-child interaction. And so that includes letting them know, if I ask you a question, it's okay to say, I don't know. You don't have to guess. If I say something that doesn't make any sense, you can tell me and I'll try to say it in a different way. Even though I'm an adult, I definitely make mistakes. It's okay to correct me. And then there's, you know, practice examples that go along with that to kind of reinforce what we're going over. We do a bit of rapport building, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's trying to get to know the child, but at the same time, we're asking them questions in a way that we're going to be asking questions when we transition to the topic of concern. We do something called narrative event practice, which is an extremely critical part of like that first section of the forensic interview. And that is asking the child to narrate about a non-abusive, ideally like just positive event from start to finish. And that way they can get, and I will often tell kids this, like that way I can get used to the way that you talk and you can get used to the way that I ask my questions, because the way I ask questions can feel a little different. So I'll be like, all right, what's the last thing you did where you had fun or you had a good time? And kids will be like, I went to the pool yesterday. So I'll say, okay, I'd like for you to tell me everything you did when you got to the pool, went to the pool yesterday, from the beginning to the middle to the end, and don't leave anything out. And then they're going to hopefully tell me about the pool. And then as they're narrating, I'm going to kind of mimic the types of questions that I might be asking once we transition to the topic of concern. Okay, tell me all about the people that were at the pool. Tell me about the clothes you were wearing. What were you thinking when you were in the pool? Right, asking these like really broad, open-ended questions, trying to elicit as much narrative and as much detail as possible. And a lot of times when we finish that, again, depending on the age of the kid, I'll say, okay, thank you for telling me about going to the pool. That's just how I ask my questions. I just want to know everything that you're telling me in here with as much detail as possible. So that all of that in the front end helps the child acclimate to the conversation we're about to have, and it helps me get a sense of how they communicate and how they might be showing up for the interview that day.
Yeah, that's perfect. So I'm sure there's a whole laundry list of different types of kind of background situation that you have before the child comes in. But let's take a scenario where you have sexual abuse that's been happening with the child, like 5 to 7 years old, whatever it may be, and the child has been instructed by the abuser, so the parent, whoever, the uncle, whatever the situation is, to keep this a secret. If you say anything, people are going to get in trouble. So they have been essentially threatened to keep this information private. When you then get into a situation with a child forensic interviewer where they're trying to get them to extract that information, that very information that they are terrified to talk about for those reasons, like, can you kind of talk through how that process, do you prime the kid and let him know, like, hey, I know you may have been told, or if you've ever been told, to keep things a secret, this is a safe space. Like, can you talk about how you overcome that particular unique challenge?
Yeah, that is a not uncommon barrier to not just kids participating in the forensic interview, but to disclosing, period. Mm-hmm. So I think, one of the first things I would want to know as the interviewer is this child in active disclosure? Like, how did this information get out? Because if I have a child who's not in active disclosure, that is going to be a lot more challenging than a child who is. And so if the allegation came out accidentally or because there was some other evidence that got discovered, that's a lot different than a kid that decided to tell an adult, right?
Sure.
So in the interview, I'm able to do kind of a delicate walk of providing some social support. And that is supported by research in forensic interviewing, that if I can demonstrate some social support to the child, that can have positive effects on the interview. And I can do so in a way that's not leading or coercive or suggestive. So I can say things like, kids come to talk to me about all kinds of things. It's okay to say any kinds of things, to use any words. You're not going to get in trouble with me, or you're not in trouble with me today, and nothing that you tell me today is going to change that. I will oftentimes ask barrier assessment questions. I'll say, a lot of times when I talk to kids, they're feeling scared or worried about something. Is there anything you're feeling scared or worried about? And a kid might say, yeah, like I was told that if I talk about this, my mom's going to get in trouble. Mm-hmm. And all I can really do, like, I can't make any kinds of promises in that interview, but what I can do is just try to create a space to kind of explore those concerns with the child. Sometimes we can kind of overcome them, and despite their worries, they will still go on to talk to me. But sometimes it's a real barrier to talking about what happened, and I sometimes have to respect that and talk with the team about about how we can keep this kid safe and still kind of respect the boundary that they're drawing that day. And our ability to do that's going to depend on kind of the level of risk of harm that there might be to the child if they don't talk about the allegation that day, and kind of how far we might need to try to push, for lack of a better phrase, to find out about the allegation before the child leaves there. But a lot of times we're able to say, like, okay, this kid is safe. They're saying, like, I'm not ready to talk about this today. And so my job as an interviewer, after kind of trying some of those things to provide some social support, to kind of explore their anxiety and see if there's other ways that we can overcome it. My job might be to say, like, I hear you when you say you don't want to talk about that, and that's okay. Sometimes people come back and talk to me a different time. Like, how would you feel about, thinking about coming back and talking with me again? And sometimes that can go a long way with kids, helping them feel like they have some control over a part of their lives that is wildly out of control. And so sometimes it's important for me to kind of sit there and respect that barrier that the child has put up.
Yeah, especially if the sense of urgency and there's not like an immediate threat to the child's safety. I'd imagine that the prolonged relationship that you can develop with that child, and the next time they come, the level of trust they have with you, I'm sure is exponentially more than the first interaction that you were able to establish. And hopefully that yields more information. But that's pretty cool. So I had a situation recently where a friend had reached out, and they had a scenario where she had believed that possibly her son had been assaulted. She had minimal information going into it, but it was enough to kind of raise some concerns and red flags that I directed her towards the reporting process so that she could have her son interviewed. My question is kind of geared around like the time frame between the observation from the caregiver of potential concern to the time when the child is actually able to be interviewed. So that could be, like you said, if there was a disclosure made, that your suggestion was within 48 hours ideally, so that because there's some urgency there. But if there's no disclosure and it's just a concern that's introduced by the caregiver, I'd imagine that time frame's a little bit longer between notice of concern and conversation. If you were to provide advice or consult to like the caregiver of things to do or really maybe to avoid during the time where they notice that there may be an issue to the time where they're able to get in and have their child interviewed by a forensic interviewer, what would your feedback be to kind of ensure that the child's memory, if there is anything that happened, is not contaminated? Like, would you instruct them, don't talk to your child about your concerns directly, don't have them interact with the parent that you believe may be involved in the abuse? Like, what does that look like?
So first I want to say that the decision to interview quickly, the only factor isn't immediate risk of harm or has this kid disclosed. It's important for investigators to also consider, like, what exactly is the concern? How reliable is that source of information about the concern? How old is the child? Because if we're talking about a really young child, even if they're not an active disclosure, if we have a concern about like an observed behavior, you still want to get them in fairly quickly, because a 4-year-old, tomorrow was yesterday is 2 weeks ago. Like, it's important to talk to really young ones fairly quickly. So I just wanted to kind of say that too. And I will also say, like, I'm talking a lot about best practice, but that's not necessarily what everybody is able to do. It's not necessarily what multidisciplinary teams have agreed to in their like memoranda. So I just wanted to put that out there as well.
Yeah.
As far as advice to a caregiver, I think that, yeah, some of that is probably really helpful, not asking your child anything about the behavior or about the allegation. Certainly, if your child wants to talk about it, be a supportive, non-judgmental listener, as hard as that would be for a caregiver to hear, as non-reactive and as supportive as possible. And if there is an interview or something set up where the child is going to be talked to, try to set them up for success. So many caregivers still, like, even with some support and a pre-call from our advocates, will tell kids, like, we're going to the doctor tomorrow. And so, like, I'll be in an interview and kids will be like, are you going to check my teeth? When are you checking my teeth? And I'll be like, I don't want to see your teeth.
Yeah.
Please don't show me your teeth.
Yeah.
And so, like, they'll tell their kids they're going to a doctor's appointment, that they're going wherever, right? And so, just setting them up to be like, hey, tomorrow we're going to go to a place that's a safe, comfortable place for kids, and a grown-up is going to ask you lots of questions. It's okay to answer that person's questions, and you're not going to get in any trouble for the things that you say. And it's just their jobs to make sure that kids are safe, and just kind of leave it at that. Like, that's not coaching. That's just, like, helping them understand what the process is going to be and giving them permission to talk about whatever or not talk about whatever. I definitely, that would be my advice.
Okay. No, and that's really, really helpful. And I think in those situations, which I'm sure are common in the world that you work in, the caregiver is so worried about, the worst case scenario. And so that their kid can pick up on that stress and anxiety, and it makes their situation even more concerning when they have to show up to that office. So kind of taking that approach is really, that's helpful information.
And I just want to, again, that is why the advocacy piece is such an important part of this whole system. There's tons of research that talks about how the most important factor in kids' abilities to or willingness to disclose abuse and then kind of participate in a subsequent investigation is a supportive, non-offending caregiver. And if you have a caregiver who is not supportive or is in crisis, or there's resource scarcity and they're not kind of able to focus on this issue, that the outcomes for that child might not look as good as if they did if they had a supported caregiver. And so our advocates, like, that's their whole job, is to kind of receive that non-offending caregiver, provide a place where that caregiver can just, like, unload all of those worries, understandably, and hopefully they can kind of take some of that stress off the caregiver so that the child isn't feeling that.
That's
I
great.
just had one more question with the situation of the interviewer and understanding what the role is of the interviewer, and that's to get the child comfortable so that you can get information to figure out if something's going on and stop whatever it is. It's got to be pretty difficult, though, at sometimes to recognize the job is not to influence the child's narrative, right? So if you have a caregiver and an offender, let's say, like, they both live in the same house, a husband and a wife, and one of them is the offender and the other one has concerns that they're assaulting their child. If the child has been coached in any way, like, so if the offender has said, you need to say this when they ask you this question, if you as the interviewer are picking up on, this isn't in line with, like, their communication style, this isn't in line with even, like, some of the vernacular that they're using that is outside of, like, the scope of how they've been talking to me, do you have a job to pry, like, to dig deeper and to assess whether or not you think that this came from the kid, or whether or not you believe that this information may have been kind of coached through them, or is that not up for where you guys would get involved?
No, I think those questions that to kind of get at get at that are absolutely appropriate and I think are incorporated in most of my interviews. I would kind of include that under the umbrella of kind of source monitoring. Like, how do you know that? What makes you say that? I think it's appropriate to kind of ask that of a child, no matter whether or not you have coaching concerns. And so a lot of times I'm asking kids about like, is there anything you're not supposed to talk about today? Is there anything you are supposed to talk about today? How do you know X? What makes you think X? What made you decide to say X, Y, Z to your teacher? Tell me all about that. So kind of exploring the context around disclosure or recantation or whatever the circumstances is absolutely appropriate. And it's kind of my job to kind of explore that, provide the child an opportunity to kind of explain from their perspective those different things. But it's not my job to interpret that.
Okay.
But it's absolutely, like, I think it's super critical to ask those types of questions in the interview.
Yeah, and that's before we hit record, we were talking about like assessing credibility statements from kids, and that's kind of what I was getting at. Like, if somebody says something that kind of raises some red flags with you, what you just said is perfect. Like these source coding questions of, well, can you tell me a little bit more about what makes you feel that way, or what made you say that? Because then you can say they said it, and then they actually supported it with this type of statement. So that's a really I'd imagine critical part of kind of validating some of the disclosures that kids make.
Yeah.
Kate, I know we're out of time and want to be mindful of that. Is there anything about child forensic interviewing or the role or kind of what you do day to day that we didn't touch on that you want to share or talk about?
I don't think so. I know, Tony, you mentioned you have folks in law enforcement as part of your audience. You have folks maybe in like as private sector investigators in your audience. I just want to reiterate that if you have concerns about a child, and when I say child, including teenagers, report it. Don't interview them. Let kind of the professionals intervene. Hopefully, if it's needed, they'll be forensically interviewed.
Yeah, it's really, really good advice especially for people that they've been trained in doing interviews, but the interview training is not a like generalized, okay, you went through a 2-day class, you're good to go, you can talk to anybody. That's probably making a more dangerous encounter than a more helpful and productive one. So yeah. That's great advice. I have one last very quick question. If somebody their interest has been piqued and they're now very curious about, okay, well, I love interviewing and I do love working with children, how could somebody even like learn more about this path, this very niche path of getting into child forensic interviewing specifically?
Yeah, so unless you are affiliated with a child advocacy center or with an investigative agency, it's probably going to be hard to get formalized training in forensic interviewing. There's a lot that you can read about the history of it and about the protocols that are out there on the internet. If you're interested in getting training as an investigator, if you go to the National Children's Alliance, they have a list of NCA approved forensic interview protocols. There's a handful of nationally recognized ones. They're all kind of based on the same research, but they all have kind of their little quirks and differences. And so if you're wanting to be trained in forensic interviewing, that's a list of protocols. I would say if you know or work with the CAC, a good way to get connected with forensic interviewing resources is to connect with your CAC and connect with your forensic interviewer, because they're going to be plugged in to trainings and might even be able to kind of get you into a training like as part of their team at a discounted rate. So some different ways you can get plugged in or learn.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's super helpful. We'll throw those in the show notes too, some of those links. But yeah, that's very helpful. All right, cool. Well, thank you so much for taking some time to jump on. This was super informative.
This was great. Thank you so much.
We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for listening.